It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. And of course, as always, from the flight deck, that means some smart talk radios in your future. In this segment, a subject we have never, in some 780 plus shows, talked about, and that is our friend Leon Trotsky. We will learn quite a bit about him from a man named Ken Ackerman. Ken is an attorney in his real job, but he is also an author, having penned Boss Tweed, Dark Horse, The Surprise Election and Political Murder of President James A. Garfield, Young J. Edgar, The Gold Ring, and now a brand new work called Trotsky in New York, 1917, A Radical on the Eve of Revolution. That should be an interesting conversation indeed. Ken, again, is an attorney in the D.C. area, but also in the past, quite a resume indeed. Served as legal counsel for two committees, the United States Senate of the Government Affairs Committee, and then under Senator Charles Percy of Illinois in Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, under then-Chairman Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And during the administration of Bill Clinton, he headed the U.S. Agriculture Department's Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, et cetera, et cetera. Should be good. Ken, how are you, my friend?
Warner, I'm doing fine. I hope that resume didn't tire you out.
No, it might have tired you out, but being in the Beltway that long. But a question for you.
Okay.
The world of politics, whether you're, as they say, in front of the camera or behind it, and you spend a lot of time behind the camera, laboring away in those committees and doing work for them. Has writing always been a love for you? Obviously, it must have been something that piqued your interest. Was it D.C. that did that, or was it always that way?
Oh, it's been that way for a long time. D.C. did help pique my interest. And to be honest, I had written a number of long government reports on different issues, and that kind of piqued my writing interest. There were several things I wanted to talk about, write about, but I couldn't do them as a government attorney or as a government worker because I would get sued if I have nothing else. So the idea of writing history as a way to talk about current events has always appealed to me very much.
Well, Trotsky, most people would say, if you think Trotsky, you think 1917, the co-leader of the Marxist revolution that seized power in Russia, and yet few people know that he has some roots and some very real formative years and time in New York City. And that's, I guess, where this story begins. Share with our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit, first of all, why the interest in Trotsky, and secondly, tell us, let's just set the stage of how he got to New York.
Okay. Well, Trotsky is one of those people who always interested me. I took a course in Russian history back in college, and when I did, I read Trotsky's book on the Russian Revolution, and the way he wrote, the way he made people interesting, the way he made events exciting, it was clear to me, at least, that this was a person with a very active mind, a very original mind, and someone who I'd always wanted to get back to, always wanted to write about. What got me interested in this story was my last book that I wrote a few years ago called Young J. Edgar, about J. Edgar Hoover and the Red Scare right after World War I in 1919, 1920, that's the Palmer raids. I became very aware of the presence of radicals in America, of the early communist movement in America, the labor movement, the anarchists, and others. And I tripped over the fact that Leon Trotsky, someone you'd least expect, had spent time in the United States just before the Russian Revolution. In fact, right up until the overthrow of the Tsar. Trotsky was not in Russia at that moment. He was working on Greenwich Village. I mentioned this fact to a few people, and I found very quickly that very few people were aware of this at all. It had rarely been written about. In many of the biographies of Trotsky, there's maybe a page or two on it, but it had never been explored. And what struck me about it was that Trotsky was such a radical figure. He was always on the far left wing of any group he was in. He was always an activist, always trying to find something to do, something to disrupt. The fact that he could be in New York City for about 10 and a half weeks and really nobody notice seemed to me very striking.
Well, sorry to interrupt you here. So a question for you. Those of us that do not know, were his exploits well known then prior to his coming to America?
They were well known among a small group of people. Trotsky was in his late 30s at this point in his life. He was born in Russia, raised in Russia, but he became involved in radical politics really as a teenager in Russia. The Tsar was very unpopular, was a very repressive Tsar, and when he was about 18 years old, he got involved in setting up an illegal workers' union in a little town called Nikolaev, which is near Odessa, and was arrested for the first time. He was sent to Siberia with his wife at the time, and he managed to escape. And when he escaped, he went to the West. He moved to London, where he wanted to be mentored by the head of the then budding socialist democratic movement, a man named Vladimir Lenin. The two of them became acquainted. Trotsky was a very talented writer, a very talented speaker, and he started writing prolifically about socialism and about problems in Russia. And within that group, within the socialist movement, and particularly the left of the socialist movement, he became well known. It was a movement that was driven by fights, quarrels, infighting. The most famous was in 1903, the split between so-called Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, in which Lenin became the leading Bolshevik and Trotsky was a backer of the Mensheviks. But both of them wrote articles, diatribes against each other for many years. So Trotsky was well known in those circles. He was also well known as an opponent of the Tsar. He returned to Russia in 1905, the year of Bloody Sunday, and a series of uprisings across the country, and helped lead the uprising in St. Petersburg against the government. He became head of the St. Petersburg Soviet, a committee of workers leading a series of strikes that year. When the Tsar crushed that rebellion in 1905, Trotsky went on trial, a public trial, for his role in the uprising, and that made him very much a public figure within the radical movement of Russia and within the socialist movements around the world. So when he landed in America, his landing was actually covered by 6 or 7 newspapers, including all in New York at the time, had several socialist-leaning newspapers. The biggest was the Jewish Daily Forward, the Forwards, which had a circulation of about 200,000 at that time. And he quickly found a circle of Russian friends to work with.
So if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, of course, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. In this segment, we're talking about Leon Trotsky, actually Lev Davidovich Trotsky. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Brand new work by Kenneth Ackerman. We know him as Ken here on the show, but the work is called Trotsky. And just a fascinating look here. So it begs the question, he's in London. What motivates, what drives, and what was the key trigger to send him to, of all places, the United States?
Okay. Well, what sent him to the United States was World War I. When World War I broke out, Trotsky was living in Vienna, Austria. He was editing a small Russian newspaper, as he seemed to do wherever he landed. When the war broke out, he was forced to leave Austria because as a Russian, he would become an enemy alien once the war started. He moved for a time to Switzerland, then to Paris. In Paris, again, he edited a small radical Russian newspaper. In late 1916, the French authorities grew very suspicious of him, and on urging of Russia, their ally in the war, they expelled him from the country. They deported him to Spain. Spain didn't quite know what to do with him, so they arrested him immediately and deported him. Originally, they were going to send him to Cuba, but there were protests both from the Cubans and from Trotsky. So in late 1916, they decided to expel him to America. The United States at that point was not in World War I. We had stayed out. Woodrow Wilson had just been reelected president. on a slogan that he kept us out of war. As a result, the Americans were kind of oblivious to this whole circle of Russian radicals and what they were doing, and we welcomed him with open arms. He was basically a refugee.
So, again, we think about it, of course, as you write, where do all good left-leaning socialists live but Greenwich Village, of course. And he was prolific in his writing there and undoubtedly held sway, I'm sure, at various taverns and public gatherings and in the various parks and all. What, in your opinion, from what you have done and your research, what did you learn? Were any of his attitudes altered, shaped, reinforced, etc., by this short 2.5, 3 month period in New York?
Actually, there were changes both ways. Trotsky affected the United States, and the United States affected Trotsky. During his 10 weeks there, he actually became a leading figure in New York City politics. He gave over 30 speeches, and they weren't just on street corners. He spoke at Cooper Union, for instance, and at Beethoven Hall, and other major venues for progressive speakers, for left-wing speakers, and even moderates. He wrote dozens of articles. It was at a time when you could become a major figure in New York and not speak English. At that point, New York City was at the height of the movement of immigrants into this country that started in the late 1800s and peaked around 1920. As a result, there were hundreds of thousands of people, Russians, Poles, Germans, and others who spoke foreign languages. There were 6 daily Yiddish newspapers. There were 4 daily Russian newspapers. There were several daily Polish newspapers. And Trotsky became a major figure in the debates of those times, primarily involving the entry of the United States into World War I, always taking the extreme left-wing view. On the other side, Trotsky became very enamored of many things American. He settled his family into an apartment in the Bronx. That's where they lived. He would take the subway every day from the Bronx down to Greenwich Village and back. He became very taken with American technology, with American literature. He loved the cinema. He was a big movie buff. He started going to the movies in Paris, and at the time Charlie Chaplin was the rage, and he would spend many nights going to the movies. When he went back to Russia later, he always said that what we need to do in Russia is fight our revolution with American means. American organization, American technology. He brought back that strong belief. At one point he wrote that in the future, based on what he saw, that all of the major decisions of mankind will be decided on American soil. So he was very taken by what he saw.
I'm sure it was. That sort of begs the question, if we go a little deeper with this, while a left-leaning socialist, maybe at heart and mind, I'm wondering if in America he saw the best of America in some ways and maybe the worst. He saw probably incredible poverty at certain levels, and yet at the same time he also saw he saw cinema that was affordable to people. He saw sort of free trade and these exciting things that were happening in the West, so to speak. I'm just wondering if he thought, you know what, underneath it all there is something to this thing called capitalism.
Yeah, what he saw in America was freedom, and it was probably the freest time of his life. America was the one place where he could edit his radical journals and give his left-wing speeches with no harassment at all from the government. And in France and Austria, certainly Russia, he was always subject to censorship. He was subject to arrest. He was expelled from country after country. But in America, he could come and go as he pleased. He had a circle of friends. He spoke at dozens of different venues. The most striking moment to me was he became very active in the Socialist Party, and there was a big fight in the Socialist Party over American entry into World War I. All of the socialists were against entering the war, but Trotsky led a faction, and he raised this in a public meeting, in a public debate with newspapermen present. He raised a motion saying that if America entered the war, socialists should promote a general strike and mass actions to physically block the war effort, which is, when you think about it, is treason. And a few months in the future, once the war actually started, many people were arrested for saying just such things. But when Trotsky was there, he could do this. He could talk about it with no interference. There weren't even any police detectives in the room, even though it was a well-known meeting. He could have his public vote, and he could walk away and be a celebrity. That was a freedom he never had anywhere else where he lived.
Again, we're talking to Ken Ackerman. For many years on the political scene, served as legal counsel for numerous government subcommittees and much, much more, but also a prolific author writing about J. Edgar Hoover and his most recent work, Trotsky in New York, a fascinating look at a very, very interesting character, many of which I'm sure are surprised that he actually spent some time in the States. The next question is sort of a simple one here. He was born, again, Lev Davidovich Trotsky. Where'd Leon come from?
Well, Leon came from Russia, a part of Russia called Kherson province. It was a farming area. Trotsky's father was a farmer, and Trotsky was raised on a farm. His family was Jewish, but they had moved. There was a program in the mid-1800s under one of the czars that allowed a limited number of Jewish people to leave the shtetls, the small Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, and move into farm territory and try to join the mainstream of Russian society. And Trotsky's grandfather was the one who made that move. And by the time Trotsky was born, his father, a man named David Bronstein, was a very successful farmer. And as a result, Trotsky grew up in that area. His Jewishness was not very important to him. His family spoke Russian and Ukrainian. He had a bare minimum Jewish background, even though many people tried to impute his Jewish background onto him for a number of reasons. From there, he was educated. His family sent him to Odessa to go to high school. But right after high school, he started becoming involved in radical politics and was arrested shortly thereafter, resulting in him coming from Siberia.
Anything in particular, again, sorry to interrupt, but anything in particular from where you sit that radicalized him? Because the way you're describing it seems like he had a relatively, quote, normal, quote unquote, if there's such a thing as normal upbringing. What, in your opinion, sort of radicalized him? The conditions in Russia were very different than anything that we have experienced here in America. Russia, when he was growing up, was ruled by a very autocratic system. Not only did you have the Tsar wielding autocratic power in the country, but there was an aristocracy that held control over the country, and the treatment of particularly minorities was very cruel. And that was the atmosphere where Trotsky grew up. It was a time of pogroms, not only against Jewish people, but against other minorities as well. He quickly surrounded himself by the circles of radicals. The fact that by helping a group of local workers form a union, he ended up being sentenced to 4 years in Siberia, where he met many of the most radical people in the underground. He was in many ways pushed into it, and he found a home there. During his time in New York, I know he, as you said, he loved the freedom, the ability to express and to write and to communicate. Were his railings mostly about Russia, or did he also talk about certain conditions and try to appeal to Americans to in some way either radicalize themselves or to make changes in how the situation in the government and how the social structure was here in America?
Both. Once in America, Trotsky's ideology, he was what he called an internationalist. He believed in socialist revolution sweeping the world. That what applied in Russia should apply in America just as well. That capitalism was an evil, and at the time in America, this was the age of sweatshops. It was the age of unions trying to form but being repressed in a very violent way. The class warfare in America was not a metaphor at that point. There were outbreaks of violence that were very common. The Lawrence strike had occurred just a couple of years beforehand. The leader of the Socialist Party, which was very popular back then, was Eugene Victor Debs, who had led the Pullman strike in the 1890s. When Trotsky landed in America, he immediately joined with a group within the Socialist Party that felt that the Socialist Party was far too moderate. And the immediate issue in front of the country and the city and his circle during those 10 weeks, which to Trotsky and his friends symbolized the condition of workers of the world, was the question of whether America would enter the World War. At that point, America was neutral. But within a couple of weeks of Trotsky's arrival, Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping. A couple of weeks after that came the disclosure of the Zimmermann telegram, a telegram from the German foreign minister to the leaders of Mexico, offering them a deal that if they entered the war against America with Germany, they would, and they won, that Mexico would receive in payment the return of Texas and California and several other territories that they had lost. This issue of entry into the war became the focal point of debate. Trotsky took the view that the World War was a capitalist war. It was being fought to enrich the ammunition makers and the bankers, and workers of different countries were being asked to kill each other. And once they found out why, and they found out there was so little purpose behind the war, they would rebel. And that became the focal point. Yes, he very much wanted to see a revolution in America. The circle of Americans he surrounded himself with all reinforced that feeling.
Ken, as we start to kind of wind down here a little bit, I'm curious. You said that it was known that he was coming, or that Trotsky had arrived at America. In today's environment, would he be on some kind of a government watch list, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, even back then, when he arrived in America, he was already under surveillance by British intelligence, because Britain was in the war. They did view these radical Russians as a threat. Their biggest fear was that Trotsky and people like him might, in fact, get back to Russia and succeed in overthrowing the Tsar and take the country out of the war. In fact, in America, the British were watching him the whole time, and when he left to return to Russia, they actively tried to stop him. If this were modern times, he would be on a terror watch list. He would be shadowed by the FBI. If he stepped out of line, he would probably be locked up very quickly.
Who, again, when the Tsar fell, and Trotsky immediately gets back to Russia, as kind of we sort of winding down here, two questions for you. Number one, legacy or imprint on American political thought, particularly the American left. And two, can you point to, do you see anything from his stay in America that affected his actions or thought in any way, shape, or form in leading that revolution in 1917 in Russia?
Okay. Well, just very quickly, first the American part. When he reached America in 1917, the American Socialist Party had started to become very mainstream. It was a very moderate group of people. Their platform included many things that have become staples in American life: a graduated income tax, Social Security, a social safety net, government regulation of the financial markets, things like that. And they were very successful in doing so. What Trotsky did in America was to radicalize a part of that group to the point that they basically wrecked the American Socialist Party. They forced it so far to the left that a series of government crackdowns ended up damaging it almost beyond repair. As far as Russia goes, when Trotsky's time in the leadership of Russia was and remains very controversial. He joined Lenin as a Bolshevik. In the early years, he became first the international commissar and then the head of the Red Army. During the years when he was in power, he supported all of the most repressive measures, including the Red Terror, war, communism, militarization of labor, the banning of opposition parties, the banning of newspapers, things that you wouldn't expect from someone who had just enjoyed such freedom in America. But shortly after that, he ran into a power struggle against Joseph Stalin and was kicked out of power. It was a very bloody power struggle. And after that, he became the chief critic of Bolshevik Russia, or excuse me, of Stalinist Russia. He complained about how the bureaucracy had taken power onto itself and taken away power from the workers. He created a what's called the Fourth International, which was a collection of Trotskyist groups around the world that still believed in communism, still believed in socialism, but without the excesses, without the dictatorial overreach of Stalinism. And that part of Trotsky, the part that rebelled against Stalinism, I think did have roots in America.
Well, it is a fascinating character indeed, and do appreciate your time, Ken. Again, we've been speaking with Ken Ackerman, an attorney by day, author by night, or something in that order, and a brand new work called Trotsky in New York, 1917. Ken, tell, if you would, our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit how they can get a copy of the book and also find out a little bit more about some of the other works that you've done.
Well, thank you on that. The book is coming out. It is available it will be available in bookstores within the next couple of days across the country. It's available on Amazon.com. It's available as a Kindle ebook. It will be available as an audio book for those of you who like to listen to books while you're driving in your car. So it should be available through all those channels within the next few days. Where you're catching me at a very early point in the publishing cycle. And my other books are all available on Amazon and Kindle as well. The Young J. Edgar, Hoover and the Red Scare, my biography of Boss Tweed, my book Dark Horse about James Garfield and the Garfield assassination, and one other called The Gold Ring about the attempt by Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, two speculators from the 1860s to corner the gold market in 1869.
Well, again, appreciate your time, and would love to have you back on again with your next project.
Warner, I thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.